Hey, everybody, and welcome to Bible Study That Doesn't Suck. This is Pastor Megan, and I am at Grace Lutheran in San Francisco. We're at www.gracesf.com, and you can join us in person for worship Sundays at 10:30 a.m. and online for worship the second and fourth Tuesday of the week on my Facebook Live page, and that's at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And Wednesdays at noon, we're going to try a Zoom prayer group, which you can also find on my Facebook page. And we have...
Hi there. I'm Pastor Daniel Tisdale, and I am in C. You do this now that anyway. So I'm technically on leave from call, and what that means is I am currently not the pastor of a church. I'm between being the pastor of two different churches. I was formerly of First Lutheran of Gypsum, which still meets at 9 a.m. on Sunday mornings, and if you're in the area, by all means attend. I just won't be there. And I may be having another call that I can tell you all in a few weeks, but I can't talk about that yet. But this week I will be preaching and presiding at Vail and Beaver Creek. And if you know Vail and Beaver Creek, that's kind of cool, like really, really pretty big resort towns, and it's beautiful up there. And the Vail service is at 9:30, and the Beaver Creek service is at 11:30.
And you get to ski to church, right?
You can. I don't think both those resorts are closed now, but normally you could. There's a place like to keep your skis outside both places. It's pretty cool. But yeah, people do.
There you have it.
Beautiful, beautiful chapel. So, and the preacher this week is pretty awesome too, if I say so myself.
Oh yeah, I mean, yes, that's true.
Not that the preacher there all the rest of the time isn't really great too, but
see, you dug a hole.
I did, yeah.
So this week, if you're reading the Bible texts that are a part of the lectionary, which is the 3-year cycle of Bible readings that are read in a lot of churches, you'll get a very interesting variety of texts. And we're going to go backwards this week. Normally we start with the first reading of the day and work our way towards the gospel. But this week I think the gospel reading is maybe the least interesting of the readings. So we're going to start with the least interesting reading and work our way backwards. Sorry about a truck driving by.
I agree with that. I didn't hear the truck, so probably they didn't.
Oh, good. I'm glad you didn't hear the truck. So the reading from John, the 15th chapter, is talking about Jesus being the vine, God the creator, or God the parent being the vineyard grower, the owner of the grape farm. And then Jesus talks about how you have to bear fruit, or God doesn't love you and throws you in a pit of fire. Now, woohoo, pit of fire. No. This is one of those agricultural metaphors that Jesus is not the best at. Jesus doesn't know a lot about farming. Oftentimes his agricultural metaphors are backwards. Like there's one where he says all the weeds and the wheat should grow together. But when the weeds and the wheat grow together, it means none of them have any nutrition. And it's basically like you've made sure that the wheat would not grow successfully because you didn't take care of the weeds. And so you can't take any of Jesus's agricultural metaphors literally, or pretty much everyone in the story would be like poisonous and unedible. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the point is without God, we're unedible.
More poison.
But this is a story about bearing good fruit, and this is a story that has been harmful because sometimes people equate that to something that's in the book of Genesis, this idea that you should be fruitful and multiply. And so some people use this text to say, if you are not fertile, God doesn't love you as much as fertile people. This is a very old argument. In the book of Genesis, they thought there were actually 4 different genders. There were people who were fertile, women who were fertile, women who were infertile, men who were fertile, and men who were infertile. And so the beautiful thing about this from a trans perspective, even though it's yucky on the surface, on every level, this is a yucky idea that people are different in status based on whether or not they've had babies. But the beautiful thing that is maybe makes these texts have some sort of life or good news in them is that when God, and God does this 7 times in the book of Genesis, when God makes someone who used to not be fertile, God grants them sex change. And so if you are looking for good news that speaks to our contemporary world, and you want to proclaim that God can love all people, and this generation for some reason has picked trans people as one of the groups of people that they're going to debate whether or not God can love them, then you can talk about those 4 genders in the book of Genesis as a way to talk about God loves all people, trans people aren't a new thing, God can love them. We'll talk more about that later when we look at the Acts reading. But this story about good fruit, I do not believe is about making babies, right? I don't think it's a proclamation about fertility. And if you are someone who has heard mean things said about people who are single parents, or people who aren't having a hard time, or who are having a hard time conceiving, know that that is not Christianity at its best. In fact, I would consider it abusive. I've heard countless stories even this week of people who, I heard a story this week of someone who attended a worship service, and the pastor made the single mother confess to being a sinful person before the pastor would baptize their baby. That's not okay. Half of the congregation walked out, and the other half probably just thought, good grief. Hopefully that's what they thought. But that's not acceptable. The Lutheran Church is currently in a process of working on writings about gender violence and writing about actually repenting from a lot of the ways that we as church community have hurt each other, harassed each other, have perpetuated violence on each other, and to find ways to declare really forcefully that that's not okay. And some of the ways we do that is through things like safe church policies, like where we have background checks for people who are working with kids. Sometimes we do it by checking people when they are holding pastors who are female to a different standard than they're holding pastors who are male. I've been to congregations where if a woman would say something at the congregational meeting, no one would believe her. And if a man, even if it was his first time at that church's congregational meeting, if he said the exact same thing, everyone would go, thank you for finally answering my question. So congregations are as flawed as the fullness of our community. And as we continue to work on these issues, we have to keep working on them. So this is an opportunity for us to proclaim that we won't move those things into the future. We're a #MeToo kind of church space. And what I think is actually going on in this text is something that Jesus talks about through lots of different gospels, and it's something Martin Luther really leans into, this idea that good news is only good news if it's good news for all people, right? So if this Bible is going to be good news, and by the way, the term good news for a book is stolen from the Caesar. The Caesar's newspaper was called Good News, but it wasn't good news because the Caesar was hurting people and abusing people and imposing a lot of the Greek understandings of hierarchy that we're still trying to untangle from. And so Jesus was specifically saying, good news can't be torture. It can't be taking advantage of widows and women. It can't be not caring about kids. It can't be oppressing people. It can't be being mean to people who deal with money. That good news has to be good news for all people. And so when Jesus is saying that you have to bear fruit in the world, Jesus is saying that you need to have goodness that can be experienced within someone's body, right? Grapes taste good on our insides. And this is a wine vineyard, which is an interesting, it calls up the wedding at Cana where Jesus overproduces wine after people are already drunk. It's an excess fruit, not a survival fruit. So this is being good in excess. And that's what I think is kind of the beginning of what Jesus is up to in this story. Dan, you look like you have thoughts.
Oh, I always have thoughts. I'm someone that thinks of faith is most important in community, and I really rally around the community care aspect of a faith community is as important as anything else. And so for me, when I read this text, I guess I think it's, when I hear people say, well, I can be a good Christian at home by myself, and I'm like, yeah, but that's not how it works. That's not how it's designed. And actually we are better in community because it's about caring for each other and for the world, and that our efforts are multiplied in that sense. And so our good fruits that are the way we take care of each other in the world are multiplied if we're in community. So the idea that this gospel brings up about being disconnected, then we're not able to. You can't abide in me, and abiding in Jesus is abiding in the community is really what it is. So I'm a proponent of at least right now. I don't believe that there are many places in our society aside from church where you have that. There are communities, don't get me wrong. There's plenty of places you can find community, but a community that is designed to care for each other, and to care for each other without judging. Not that we always do that well. That just doesn't exist. So until the world can learn to care for each other, that's the role of the church right now. So the idea of the vine being we're all connected, not just in one community, but different faith communities are connected. And cutting yourself off from that makes it hard for you to connect the world and take care of each other. It makes it hard for you to bear good fruit. And we are more able to bear good fruit. And like you said, it's not about procreating, making children as much as it is as doing the work of the kingdom and taking care of people, each other, and those that need us the most, feeding the hungry and clothing the naked, that sort of thing. We're more able to do that when we're in community. So cutting ourselves off, and that's the thing. It's not that Jesus is cutting anyone off. It's where that says, whoever does not abide in me is thrown away. It's almost like they take themselves away. Well, you're not going to do it, then you're just going to wither and die and be taken away. That's not how we're designed, I don't think. So it's an interesting text. We had talked before we recorded about plants are almost always healthier when they get pruned. And sometimes I think this text is often used as a justification to prune people out of community. And sometimes there is justification for that. Sometimes a community is healthier without people that can sort of be difficult to deal with. But I think that's also can be overused and be problematic in a lot of settings. But it is true that parts of a tree or a vine, it makes the plant healthier in a general way. And I think that sort of exists in not just in this text, but a couple other texts that where Jesus is talking that what does it mean to be pruned? And for me, it's not about. It could be about pruning the people that are problematic, but I think it's also possibly about pruning the parts of ourselves that don't let us connect with each other. The parts of our how can I personally prune the parts of me that impede the growth of the community, right?
And we can show that whoever crafted this lectionary, and we know who crafted it was a bunch of bishops, right, who gathered.
Yep.
But the people who crafted this lectionary wanted us, when we were thinking, what does it mean to be of God? What does it mean to bear good fruit? What does it mean to abide in Jesus? It says, whoever abides in me and I abide in them, they are the good fruit, right? So what does that mean? Does it mean I have to follow XYZ list of rules that someone came up with? Does it mean that I have to make my bed every day? What does it mean? The second reading for Sunday, which is from 1 John, the 4th chapter, tells us exactly what that means. We are to love one another. We are to love one another because love is from God. Everyone who loves Everyone, not everyone unless you follow my rules, everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Boom, right? And if you still think, yes, but if you are truly born of God, that means that you're going to follow that list of rules. You can kind of scroll down to the later verses, like 17 and 18, where it says that we get to be bold on the day of judgment because Jesus is bold in the world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not reached perfect love. We love because Jesus first loved us. Those who say, I love God and hate my brothers and sisters are liars. For those who do not love their brother and sister, whom they have seen, cannot love God, with whom they have not seen. And so here's the thing. If your brother or your sister doesn't follow the set of rules that makes you happy or that you think makes God happy, you don't get permission to tell them to bugger off, right? You don't get permission to say God doesn't love you. It's not your job to be the one who prunes the vine. It's God's job. And if you wonder, what is the checklist that I need to make sure that my family will go to heaven with me? Read that first sentence of 1 John again. To love one another and to experience love as our way of learning about God. And it's not about fear and it's not about punishment. And so every time we are able to better learn about love, we are able to better learn about a part of God, right? Martin Luther experienced this. He thought he was going to be celibate forever. Celibate forever. And then his sexuality changes from asexual to married, not because he wanted to, but because Catherine von Bora made him. He ends up being in love. He has a lot of children, and then he learns again a new aspect about how to love God by loving his children. And then he learns even more how to love God when he loses one of his children to death, right? And so our ways of knowing God, here's what I'll say. When you are able to love people, whether it's platonic, whether it's physical, whether it is spousal, whether it is friendship, right? All the ways that you love other people in this world is an opportunity to experience and receive love and to help you learn how to receive that love from God, and an opportunity for you to learn how God loves other people in your trying to figure out how to love. So on those days when you're pissed off, God hasn't helped you with whatever thing, think about how someone you have loved has been pissed off when they felt like you could not help them. And when out of your love, you tried to learn to be better, then you know that God can be in a truly real relationship with you, even when God disappoints you, because in that maintaining of relationship, you and God are learning how to love each other better throughout your life. And so queer theologians would even go as far to say that we experience God through sexual pleasure and through orgasm. You, in your own faith piety, might not take it that far. But for some people, every intimate encounter that they're a part of is an opportunity to love God and to orient themselves towards God. And you get to figure out what good fruit is for you in your own bodily relationships with other people. Dan.
That makes sense, because that I think one of the more underrated passages, one of the underrated sections in this particular passage, and it happens in a couple other places also, is God is love. Mm-hmm. Like my whole perception of who is God, how does God function in the world? Like I've always believed since I was a little kid that God is in and through us, and so loving each other is loving God, literally. Mm-hmm. But I also don't believe that God is the what we call the clockmaker God sitting on a cloud somewhere just watching and saying that, like that. I think God is here with us. So going back to what I said about community with the gospel, if God is in the community, God is the community, which is maybe a little surreal to sort of think about, then loving each other is following our commandment to love God and each other. I mean, it's tied up in this. And I did some premarital counseling this week. I think in one of my last ones I had talked about another session of premarital counseling, but we talked about some of the texts and there's the First Corinthians, first or Second Corinthians. Boy, I'm not looking like a good pastor now. The Corinthians text about love is fine, but it's more. Is it first? I was right the first time. Thanks. Is fine, but it's, if you know the Greek from that, it's a different. It changes the way that looks. It's not really about relationships in the same way. Where this is more, this text is more about those relationships. Mm-hmm. So this is a more appropriate text for a wedding for me, because this is about the interpersonal connectedness in a better way than the Corinthians text. Not that the Corinthian text is a bad text, but it gets overused a lot, and it doesn't mean totally what they think it means if you really read it in its context.
And then the next text takes it even farther. The Acts reading says, so there's another group of people that are even farther out there who in some of the writings in Deuteronomy is very interested in like who's in, who can step the closest to the most holiest places in the sanctuary, like whether or not the fibers in your fabric can match. I'm fine. I'm 100% wool today from Iceland.
Everything is 100% wool.
Yeah. So like, I think Deuteronomy is very into this needs to be this, that needs to be that, things can't combine. And so there are some writings that talk about like walking things can't be crawly things, and crawly things can't be walky things. And if you swim, you can't walk on the floor, right? So it's all about things not being in the non-binary spaces of life, right? Contemporary society, we've got some things to say about those places in the non-binary of life. We want to be able to wear whatever pants we want to. We want to be able to have whatever length of hair we want to, and to decide if we should wear a hat inside of our church. In the same way, there are some texts about bodies, physical bodies and genitalia, and it talks about the proximity that you can get to the holiest place of God mattering what your genitalia looks like. This is the time where I pause and say, if your congregation ever checks, leave that congregation and report them. Nobody should be checking for these things to decide where you get to sit in church, okay? So they believed.
I want to interrupt 1 second.
Yeah.
I think people sometimes are uncomfortable saying, well, when does the Bible talk about genitalia? And I'm like, all the time.
Oftentimes the euphemism is feet.
Feet, like or they talk about a lot of Paul's letters are talking about whether people should be circumcised or not, which is talking about genitalia. Like almost every letter is talking about that. This reading today, it's there a lot, and if it's not there, there's code words for it. It's always talking about gender a lot.
That's right. The norm in the Bible is that private parts would have surgery done to them. A surgery called circumcision, so that your private parts would have a scar. So it's kind of it's a thing, right? So in the Deuteronomic kind of idea of who can be the closest to God, if you have male parts and female parts, and it's unclear which parts are which, and it becomes confusing for society, then the idea is that you should be farther away from that holiest space. So we have a reading here in Acts that is questioning all of those rules about who can sit where, who's allowed to be inside church, who's allowed to do what. Because the people who lived in those mixed spaces, sometimes they were called eunuchs, sometimes they had other names. In most religions around the globe, trans folk were the holiest because they were able to counsel both men and women with their own personal life experiences. It's only later that people kind of forgot that. But in this context, and in the Middle Eastern context too, imagine that all the people who knew how to read were transgender, because that's pretty much what the world was like, right? Eunuchs, who were either people who had been born intersexed or in a gender diverse way, or who had intentionally harmed their own private parts in a way that made them no longer fertile, which, by the way, is the requirement in several states in the United States to be able to change your driver's license.
Wow.
That's not just. So they had either done it intentionally or their families had done it to them without their consent, so that they could be high-ranking officials, so that they could have these prestigious roles. The people who were scribes, who were the ones who had access to the Bible, who were copying it, and in many cases changing it as they copied it, and adding bits and fixing parts that they thought maybe were wrong, they were eunuchs. They were transgender. So the earliest people who had access to biblical text, the earliest people who had access to sharing wisdom to royalty, the earliest people who hung out with females in a royal setting were all eunuchs, most of them primarily men because of the class roles of that day and age, or people who had male bodies assigned to them at birth, and then lived in this new place of either modifying or mutilated or in-betweenness in their adolescence and in their adulthood. So if your only experience of trans people is noticing people who are trans who are poor, or who are sex workers in your neighborhood, or people who are not as well resourced, that is not who the Ethiopian eunuch is in this text, right? The Ethiopian eunuch is going to be the smartest person in the room. And in this case is traveling with royalty, traveling with the Ethiopian queen. It's thought that the Ethiopian eunuch was actually the equivalent of like the head of the Department of the Economy in Ethiopia, right? So this is a very smart person. It's going to be a very wealthy person, a very well-read person. Having access to biblical scrolls was not common. You didn't travel with the book of Isaiah. It's not even known if like Jesus had his own copy, right? And so this is someone who's traveling just randomly with a copy of Isaiah and can read it, and knows enough about Philip that when Philip approaches this carriage, knows which part of Isaiah to read out loud in order to get what the eunuch wants. So this is a eunuch who wants to be restored to justice. It's a eunuch who wants to be a part of a faith community that is accepting of them. And so this eunuch scrolls to the part of Isaiah that is going to compel Philip, like a good lawyer or a good sneaky kid who wants to get a toy, and doesn't ask, doesn't say, I should be baptized. Let me tell you 12 reasons why I should be baptized. Says, what would prevent me from being baptized? And as a pastor, I'll tell you this, if anyone ever says to me, what would prevent me from being baptized? I will baptize you, right? There was actually a child who was at a Swedenborgian congregation. I'm not a Swedenborgian minister, but it was the baptismal font that had been used to like baptize like Robert Frost or somebody really cool like that. And it's like a giant seashell from the like 1900s. And a choir member who was not a member of that congregation brought her 5-year-old child because they were going to a Lutheran school and everyone else was baptized and they felt bad that they were not baptized. The mom didn't know how to raise the child in Christianity, but she said, Pastor Megan's preaching on Sunday, and if I would be comfortable with anyone baptizing my kid, it would be Pastor Megan. I don't know how I feel about Christianity or about teaching that to other people. The child wanted to be baptized, and so the parent brought them, and her literal question to me was, what are the things that are preventing my child from being baptized? And she said, I'm not a member here. I don't know if I believe in God. I don't know if my kid's been like trained in things. And so when someone said to me, what is to prevent me from baptizing this kid? I said nothing, and we did it. I asked the Swedenborgians where they kept their baptismal records. They didn't know. I asked them how they filled the baptismal font. They hadn't done one in so long. They didn't know. We found a bottle of water from the choir. We filled up the font, And the child declared they wanted to be baptized. They were at a Lutheran school where they were learning about God and learning about Lutheran tenets. So that got to be enough for them. And that kid got baptized. I've baptized a parent in a garden with a garden hose because her mom was a single mother and way too busy to be able to take time off work on a Sunday to be able to get her baptized, and she always felt bad about it. And she said, I know I'm not regularly attending church. In fact, I live next door to a Lutheran church and I've never been inside of it because I feel so bad that I wasn't able to be baptized. What is to prevent me from being baptized? And that person got baptized with the garden hose in the middle of a garden labyrinth. There was another girl in a bar whose grandmother hadn't spoken to her in 20 years because she hadn't been baptized. Her mom and the grandmother still had not worked out whatever they had been fighting about, the reason that the parent had decided not to baptize her. And with a glass of ice cold water in the middle of a bar, we baptized her using the heart of her grandmother who desperately wanted her to be baptized. And the next day she called her grandmother. They had their first conversation in 20 years. And that grandmother is sharing her Lutheran faith with her. So
Wow.
Anytime someone says, what is to prevent me from being baptized? A pastor baptizes them, right? Because it's God that does it, not someone else. So this is a very smart eunuch, a very rich eunuch, who does not, in an overbearing way, say to Philip, you have to baptize me. Here's a 5-point plan about it. He doesn't debate it. It's not amendable. The Holy Spirit says, go to that wagon, and he does.
Well, the eunuch doesn't even.
Philip baptizes the eunuch, and the eunuch overwhelmingly rejoices and tells everyone the story. And like all of the best people who have evangelized, new converts are the best. Like Augustine, new convert, decided to write an entire collection of books on it. Paul, new convert, told everybody, right? This eunuch made it so that we never have to debate again whether or not trans people can go to the holiest places. And so I sit next to this altar in here today to be a trans person who gets to be on both sides of this altar, who gets to share communion and who gets to baptize. And it's because of this Ethiopian eunuch and Philip, who had the bravery to get in the lake or get in the river when someone said, what's to stop me from being baptized? So if you're a pastor who needs more bravery, let this text be it for you. If you're a trans person who needs to know that God loves you, let this text be it for you. If you're someone who just likes to secretly read the Bible in your house and watch videos about it, but you don't talk to other people of faith about it, let this text inspire you to talk to other people in community. But it's a good text, and I hope that most people who are preaching in churches on Sunday will remember the Ethiopian eunuch and not make it a story of, oh, look how smart Philip was, but will recognize the contributions of the eunuch in this story.
Well, the eunuch is totally in control of the situation. Like I love that about that. I feel like Philip's sort of like overwhelmed by the whole thing because every step along the way, it's the eunuch that makes the decisions. You know that. Well, then the Spirit said to Philip, go over to the chariot. But the eunuch has already chosen to read Isaiah. The eunuch, when he said, it's funny, when the eunuch asked the question about, well, what's to prevent me from being baptized, he doesn't wait for Philip to answer. He just stops the chariot and goes down the water. Like, well, you're coming with me.
That's right.
So going to that about whether we think we're worthy, because like a lot of people worry about that. Am I worthy of this? You know, take charge of that. You are worthy. And if someone tells you you're not worthy, leave that place or tell them, no, you're wrong. I'm worthy. Because that's what the eunuch was doing, right?
That's right.
The eunuch was saying, I'm not even going to give you a chance to judge whether I'm worthy or not, because I'm not part of your culture. I'm not Jewish. I'm not Christian in any sense, the way I've read this. But I'm going to decide what is right for me. And if you can't accept me as part of your community, as a baptized part of this community, then I'll find someone else to baptize me. Right. He doesn't even give Philip a chance, you know, which is great, which I think is wonderful, you know.
And I love this text because if you still are wondering, well, do I have to reproduce in order for God to love me because of how people have used that vineyard text? The eunuch is literally someone unable to reproduce, whom is being declared, nothing can ever separate you from the love of God. Right? It's like a mic drop of responding to the ways that people have abused and misused scripture. And
Yeah.
anytime someone lies to you and says you can't be loved by God, you can respond with, nothing will ever separate me from the love of God. Neither death nor life, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come. Nothing will ever separate me from the love of God. And if you don't want to memorize that whole thing, you can just say, because it's fast.
And because of the text, I'm just going to say, I love you, Megan.
Oh, I love you. You're the best.
No, you're the best.
No, you're the best. Well, and I love everybody who is out there. Thank you for being awesome. You made it all the way to the end of this video, which is no small feat. You can message either of us if you need some pastoral care. And if you are inspired to learn more about baptism, let me know, because myself and Pastor Amanda and Dan, or maybe even another pastor near you, could help you in that conversation, or it could just show up with some water. Whatever works for you. All right. Take care, everybody. You're awesome. Hold on. I'm doing this on my phone, so it's harder.
Is this part going to be?
I will end the video.